Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. Today's video will focus on several big developments in US-China relations. As anticipated over the weekend, the US House of Representatives passed the defense bill that includes a potential TikTok ban. The US Senate will likely pass it today or tomorrow, and the White House has signaled that Biden will sign it into law. The next step will be a legal and PR battle by TikTok. Michael Beckerman, TikTok's head of public policy for the Americas, told staff in a note over the weekend, quote, "This is the beginning, not the end of this long process. At the stage that the bill is signed, we will move to the courts for a legal challenge," end quote, adding that the legislation is unconstitutional. ByteDance, the parent company, seeks to argue that forcing 170 million Americans off the platform will deprive them of their First Amendment rights to free speech. Proponents of the bill, however, argue that there is over 100 years of legal precedence permitting Congress to block media companies controlled by foreign adversaries from operating in the US. ByteDance expects it can get a restraining order on the legislation and then wage a legal battle that could last more than a year. State media has joined the narrative battle too. This week it posted a series of English-language videos containing Americans. One from state-run CGTN was presented by an American comedian and political commentator called Lee Camp, in which he argues that the real reason the US wants to ban TikTok is the large number of pro-Palestinian videos on it. Next up for US-China developments, a military delegation from the United States led by Commander of the US Pacific Fleet Stephen Kohler has arrived in Qingdao, Shandong Province, via high-speed rail to attend the 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium on Sunday. Prior to this, he had made a brief visit to Beijing. State media explains that the symposium is being held from Sunday through to tomorrow in Qingdao, hosted by the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Navy, for the first time in 10 years. The theme of this year's symposium is Seas of a Shared Future. Meanwhile, tomorrow, Wednesday, US Secretary of State Blinken will visit Shanghai and Beijing for a 3-day trip. This is the senior official's second trip to China in less than a year, and unlike figures like Yellen or John Kerry, Beijing very much sees Blinken as a China hawk. UK-based The Financial Times, citing multiple sources, reports that he is expected to tell Beijing leadership that the US and its allies are becoming increasingly impatient with Beijing's refusal to stop providing Moscow with support for its defense industrial base. This will be, of course, no surprise for regular viewers. The Financial Times added that in an interview, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell said China was undermining European security by supplying Russia with dual-use technologies at the same time as trying to develop closer economic and political ties with Europe. Quote, "What we've tried to underscore with European and Chinese interlocutors is that these dual objectives are inconsistent and that we want China to think very carefully about the way forward." End quote. Several people familiar with the situation said the US is considering sanctions on Chinese financial institutions and other entities. Quote, "I am not sure why Blinken thinks warnings will work this time, unless he makes it clear there is a package of sanctions on one or more major PRC financial institutions ready to go, something the US has been reluctant to do because of concerns about damage to the global financial system from going after any of the major financial institutions. Blinken will meet Wang Yi, and I think there is hope he will get another audience with Xi, but the PRC side will likely wait to see how the meetings go before taking him to see Xi." End quote. In an official statement from the United States Department of State, 3 goals for the trip were articulated. Quote, "First, making progress on key issues. Second, the Secretary will clearly and directly communicate US concerns on a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues. And third, the Secretary will make clear that the United States intends to responsibly manage our competition with the PRC." End quote. State media is ramping up for the Blinken visit too. In a piece published today, state-run The Global Times writes, quote, "The recent bizarre narratives on China are all essentially disguises to justify the US weaponizing economic issues in order to shift the blame away from the Biden administration's policy failures. If Washington, which has recently engaged in growing interactions with Beijing, is sincerely looking to ensure that bilateral relations stay on course. It should abandon its domineering approach and communicate with China on an equal footing. Otherwise, bilateral tensions are at risk of escalating into a broader conflict." End quote. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, PRC ambassador to the United States, Xie Feng, gave a speech at Harvard where, among other meetings, he had a conversation with Professor Graham Allison of the Thucydides trap fame and founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. Xie's conversation with Allison was long and full of complaints, a major one being US sanctions against US companies. We remember that Beijing has become increasingly concerned about technology restrictions in recent months. Ambassador Xie expressed, quote, "By slapping sanctions on Chinese companies, according to its own domestic law, the US side is basically keeping Chinese players out of the game even before it starts. The US side has also forced other countries to ban exports of certain devices and technologies to China. For instance, lithography machines. This is just like asking others to run barefooted or on straw slippers, while one wears high-tech track shoes in a race. But even when barefooted, some top Chinese players, such as producers of electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and other products, have managed to take the lead. The US side, however, then accuses them of being overcompetent, causing overcapacity, and posing a threat to other contestants, demanding they quit the game. This is not fair." End quote. Xie also spoke to the Harvard-China Forum. During his talk, 6 protesters disrupted him and were removed. The demonstrators protested China's stance on Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, East Turkestan, in the words of the protesters, and Taiwan. And on this point, yesterday, Monday, the US State Department released its 2023 Country Reports on Human Rights Practices report. Its comments on China were especially sharp. The China section opens with, quote, "Genocide and crimes against humanity occurred during the year in China against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. Significant human rights issues included credible reports of arbitrary and unlawful killings by the government, enforced disappearances by the government, torture by the government, involuntary or coercive medical or psychological practices, harsh and life-threatening prison and detention conditions, arbitrary arrest and detention by the government, including, since 2017, of more than 1 million Uyghurs and members of other predominantly Muslim minority groups in extrajudicial internment camps, prisons, and an additional unknown number subjected to daytime-only re-education training, instances of coerced abortions and forced sterilization, crimes involving violence, targeting members of national, racial, and ethnic minority groups, including Uyghurs, trafficking in persons, including forced labor, and prohibition of independent trade unions, and systemic restrictions on workers' freedoms of association, and existence of some of the worst forms of child labor." End quote. We should not expect Blinken's meetings with Chinese leadership this week to be especially warm and friendly. Next up, China's swimming doping scandal blows up. Hey everyone, if you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update and you'd like to see the channel grow, liking and subscribing is the best way to do that for the channel. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below. This is the best way to keep the channel financially sustainable and allow me to continue making these episodes free and open to all 6 days a week. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. In recent days, we have seen blockbuster stories from the New York Times and German broadcaster ARD about accusations of state-sponsored doping in swimming and a cover-up. US-based The New York Times reported that 23 top Chinese swimmers tested positive for TMZ, a banned prescription heart medication that can help athletes increase stamina and reduce recovery times, 7 months before the Tokyo Olympic Games in 2021. Quote, "But were allowed to escape public scrutiny and continue to compete after top Chinese officials secretly cleared them of doping, and the global authority charged with policing drugs in sports chose not to intervene." End quote. Several of the athletes who tested positive, including nearly half of the swimming team that China sent to the Tokyo Games, went on to win medals, including 3 golds. Many still compete for China, and several, including 2-time gold medalist Zhang Yufei, are expected to contend for medals again in this year's Summer Games in Paris, the outlet reports, adding that, quote, even after other national and international anti-doping officials repeatedly provided the global regulator, known as World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, with intelligence suggesting a cover-up and doping by Chinese swimmers, the agency chose not to try to hold the athletes accountable, asserting a lack of credible evidence to challenge China's version of events. End quote. In a 100-minute video news conference on Monday, the World Anti-Doping Agency officials acknowledged the tests and said that they accepted explanations from China's anti-doping agency, China DA, that the positive tests resulted from accidental contamination before an end-of-year competition. WADA was unable to travel to China to verify the results due to COVID restrictions and instead accepted the official explanation from the government and then kept quiet. Former WADA chief executive Jack Robinson found the contamination explanation implausible, expressing this week, quote, how can a heart medication in pill form possibly accidentally find its way into hotel food and at quantities to cause 20-plus athletes to test positive? The likelihood just doesn't compute. Did these athletes all eat the same dish? Not likely. Did TMZ contaminate multiple food dishes? Not likely. And China has a history of TMZ doping. Are we to accept the investigation results of the Chinese authorities and government? End quote. The scandal continues to blow up too. US-based Associated Press reports this week that in the 2 years before the World Anti-Doping Agency signed off on clearing these 23 Chinese swimmers of intentionally taking performance enhancers, the country's government contributed nearly $2 million above its yearly requirements to WADA programs, including one designed to strengthen the agency's investigations and intelligence unit. Quote, the Chinese contributions were part of a pattern that illustrates the country's growing influence on the drug-fighting agency at about the same time WADA's relationship with its biggest contributor, the United States, was fraying. End quote. State media has hit back against these accusations, with state-run Global Times writing yesterday, quote, Chinese observers condemned the rumour-mongering for using old tricks in an attempt to slander Chinese athletes and called for an apology. End quote. Now, too, a simmering distrust between the World Anti-Doping Agency and its US counterpart has exploded into allegations of selective policing and sharp statements and threats of legal action. US Anti-Doping Agency President Travis Target expressed this week, quote, all of those with dirty hands in burying positive tests and suppressing the voices of courageous whistleblowers must be held accountable to the fullest extent of the rules and law. End quote. WADA replied soon after with its own fiery statement, calling the allegations, quote, politically motivated and delivered with the intention of undermining WADA's work to protect clean sport around the world, end quote, adding that it would send the statement to its legal counsel. The New York Times reports, citing 2 unnamed sources, that the FBI learned in the past year about the positive results, the Chinese rationale for clearing the athletes of wrongdoing, and the inaction by WADA. Federal investigations have taken steps in recent weeks to learn more about what occurred. Quote, any inquiry by the American authorities would come with a powerful new tool, a law passed in 2020 giving the Justice Department powers to criminally prosecute attempts to corrupt international sports events through doping, no matter where they take place. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.